Naval Stories podcast. Hello, friends. This is the Naval Stories podcast.
Hey, everybody. I'm Alexander Ustinov.
And I'm Alexander Uvarov. In these podcasts, we're going to talk about vivid naval stories in our own way.
The first story we've chosen is the Battle of the River Plates. It was the first artillery battle between large surface warships in World War II.
The battle broke out on December the 13th, 1939. Heavy cruiser Admiral Graf Spee took part in the battle on the German side.
Won.
She was opposed by British heavy cruiser Exeter and two light cruisers, HMS Ajax and
3.
HMNZS Achilles. What was the outcome of the battle? You're going to learn that in our podcast.
We're going to analyze the event in detail, and we hope it'll be interesting for you. On December 20th, 1939, at the Naval Hotel in Buenos Aires, capital of Argentina, Captain First Rank Hans Wilhelm Langshoff wrote a letter, a short note. To quote it, "I can now only prove by my death that the fighting services of the Third Reich are ready to die for the honor of the flag. I alone bear the responsibility for scuttling the Panzerschiff Admiral Graf Spee. I'm happy to pay with my life for any possible reflection on the honor of the flag. I shall face my fate with firm faith in the cause and the future of the nation and of my Führer." That was the letter.
If these events had happened sometime in the 14th century, I would think that the letter had been written by a noble knight setting out to fight their final battle.
We'll touch upon the nobility of our knight a bit later. We've quoted the letter because of the battle that had broken out a week before.
The Battle of the River Plate. The River Plate is a river in South America, and the famous battle took place close to its estuary in the South Atlantic.
On December 17th, 1939, the pocket battleship Armour-clad Heavy Cruiser, the ship falls under multiple classifications, Admiral Graf Spee, was scuttled off the coast near Montevideo, the capital of Uruguay. We're going to dissect this event today. The heavy cruiser, some called her pocket battleship, Admiral Graf Spee, was the third ship of the Deutschland class. She was the most advanced warship of the class, with a displacement of more than 16,000 tons. She had 6 280mm guns. Her speed was 26 knots, and her cruising range, 21,000 miles. Maximilian Von Spee was a famous German admiral in the time when the country was ruled by a Kaiser. During World War I, he won a battle near the coastline of Chile, then met his fate together with 2 of his sons close to the Falkland Islands. The ship was named after him. I have a question. Tell me, were the Germans allowed to build such an advanced ship? I mean, did they have the legal right to do so?
Germany had the right to replace their obsolete ships, armored capital ships in particular. In other words, large warships that comprised the core of their navy when their 20-year service term expired. The Treaty of Versailles, that put an end to World War I, declared that Germany was allowed to have only 6 old armored pre-dreadnought battleships. So it happened that the service term of the remaining German pre-dreadnoughts that had been built at the beginning of the 20th century, around 1902-1903, came to an end precisely at the beginning of the 1920s. Germany had a lawful right, in accordance with the Treaty of Versailles.
That's a loophole.
To build, that's right, a loophole, new armored capital ships. They were treated on the same terms as old pre-dreadnought battleships. But it's clear that we're talking about warships of a newer class, more advanced ships.
All right, what about the Washington Treaty?
Germany didn't sign the Washington Treaty of 1922. Great Britain, the United States, France, Italy, and Japan were considered to be the victors in World War I, while Germany suffered a defeat in that war. To replace their old ships, Germany could build ships with displacement not more than 10,000 tons, and their gun caliber shouldn't exceed 280mm.
It was a really advanced warship. It's an entirely new story how the ship was built. I'll tell you about that. Look, Graf Spee entered service in 1936. The first ship of the series, armoured ship Deutschland, entered service in 1933. What happened between 1918 and 1933? 1918, the Treaty of Versailles. Germany suffered a devastating defeat. They paid out war reparations in accordance with the terms of the treaty. One revolution came after another in different regions of Germany. The situation wasn't great at all. The constitution was signed in the town of Weimar, and the Weimar Republic was created. However, the inflation was just unbelievable. A loaf of bread cost 130 marks in 1922, and just a year later, 300 billion marks. Just an insane amount of money. A banknote of 5 trillion German marks has survived until now. It's just, then everything started to get better in the country. The Americans started providing credit to the Weimar Republic. The country kicked off their production, funded arts, made movies. Then in 1929, a crisis hit the United States of America. The Great Depression started, and they stopped issuing credit to the Germans, and the situation in the country went downhill again. That was when the Nazis came to power. Between 1924 and 1930, German engineers managed to design and build warships such as Deutschland. Since we've mentioned the ship and her commander, we need to talk about Hans Langsdorff, the ship's commander. Captain first rank at the moment when events occurred. Was born in 1894. In 1898, the family moved to Dusseldorf, where, according to some sources that I want to believe, as being a scriptwriter who creates stories, their new neighbor was the warship commander Maximilian Von Spee. I think that they became good neighbors, and little Hans found himself a role model to look up to, one who happened to be a famous seafarer. He entered the Naval Academy. After studying at the academy, he fought in the Battle of Jutland during World War I, was awarded the Iron Cross, and became the commander of Admiral Grafspee in 1938. At the end of August 1939, the ship was given orders to sail to the South Atlantic, where she would start raiding enemy ships upon receiving further orders at a specific moment. The order came, if I'm not mistaken, on September 25th, 25 days after World War II had broken out. Roughly speaking, the order was to sink, destroy, pillage.
Well, sink, destroy, it's as if you're talking about Blackbeard.
That's how it was to my mind. Something like Jack Sparrow on an armoured ship.
I can't agree with that. It wasn't about personal profit.
But what's the difference between personal profit and the profit of the country that sends you to sink, pillage and kill? Well, okay, not to kill.
No, first of all, well, not to kill. According to the memories of his crewmates and enemies, Langsdorff was described as a pretty nobleman. He supported the idea of a soft cruiser war. It should be remarked that at the beginning of the war, all sides observed the Hague Conventions on naval warfare, up until a specific moment.
They disembarked the crews of raided ships.
He tried to avoid killing people, naturally. He wouldn't stand for any bloodshed of civilian sailors. He disembarked sailors in lifeboats, transmitted their location over the radio, fired warning shots, examined raided vessels, acted in quite a noble way on the whole.
Grafspee had an escort vessel, Altmark, on which the captured captains of civilian ships were held. They were trophies, prizes of war captured by the German raiders.
It was important for the Germans to prevent goods from being shipped to Britain. Whether the raiders would take them or sink them together with the cargo ship, that was a secondary matter.
This way, it's better to get hold of these 19 silver ingots. That's pillaging. They were just pillagers, just pirates.
Why do you call it pillaging? It's a strategy.
It's pure pillaging. Look, they received the order on the 25th. On September 30th, they met British steamship Clement. The Germans immediately signalled something like, "Halt, we're going to pillage your ship." All right, they were not going to kill anyone, only pillage the ship and take prisoners. The British ship tried to escape, while sending out a radio transmission that an unknown and unidentified German ship had attempted to attack them. The Germans caught up with the British vessel, disembarked the crew in lifeboats, radioed the coordinates of the lifeboats. A soft cruiser wore intact, pillaged some things from the ship, launched 2 torpedoes at Clement, and had to finish the ship off with main guns because they hadn't been able to sink the British ship on the first attempt. She was the first victim of the German ship. 4 more vessels would share the same fate later. We should point out that the Germans were lucky in this respect. There was a moment when a reconnaissance aircraft from carrier Ark Royal spotted Altmark and directly requested that the ship identify herself. "We're the American cargo ship Delmar." "Is it true?" "Totally true, we swear," the Germans replied. The English pilot replied, "All right then," and flew off.
As I read in several sources, Langsdorff was using a disguise.
He was hiding as best he could. The thing is, he understood that he was going to get caught sooner or later. So he decided to leave the crime scene and travel farther away. He passed along the Cape of Good Hope and entered the Indian Ocean. The weather deteriorated, and the Germans lost an airplane, a deck-based Arado 196. It broke down and the crew couldn't fix it, no matter how hard they tried.
The raider had been operating in the Atlantic and Indian Ocean for 2 months already. They'd sunk around 5 or 6 ships.
True.
Isn't that enough? When will it end?
Basically, their mission could already have been considered a success, because the raider had done a great job. The raider had sunk around 7 or 8 ships. The British forces were hunting for her, and she had caused a sensation. So the Germans could easily have returned to Germany. But instead, the raider decided to put on her last show. So he returned again to the South Atlantic and intended to travel to the River Plate. The raider managed to pillage another couple of British vessels on the way there.
All in all, the German raider sank 9 ships.
By the way, it relates to the pirate issue we touched on earlier. He talked about noble deeds and so on. One of these ships was the British Doric Star, with meat, some other valuable food, and 19 silver ingots on board. Naturally, the Germans sank the meat and provisions along with the cargo ship, but pillaged the 19 silver ingots.
Money is money.
Everything would have come in handy for the Third Reich. I mean, it's just piracy, unvarnished piracy.
What could they have done with all that? 19 silver ingots takes less space than 20 tons of meat.
That's clear. By the way, an interesting fact. On the Doric Star, the Germans found a newspaper with a photo of British cruiser Cumberland. They looked at the photo and said, "Wow, if we paint our ship, she'll look very much like this Cumberland, and we can disguise ourselves from British ships this way."
They additionally had to mount a funnel.
And they did. Thus, they disguised their ship. So, the result was that they hid their identity. Pirates to their max, pushing their luck to the limit. They continued moving toward the River Plate. What was wrong with the British?
Why didn't they?
Didn't they notice all of that?
The British understood that the raider would be caught sooner or later, and they had dispatched 3 large task forces that were closing an encirclement in the South Atlantic. They had already figured out that it was the heavy cruiser, the famous pocket battleship. Everyone in Europe had feared before the war. What was the ship famous for? What was her purpose? The Germans designed the ship so she could escape battleships. Thus she had a decent speed, and at the same time, she could reliably destroy Washington Treaty cruisers with their 203mm guns. These types of ships were deployed to protect British sea trade routes. It was a matter of prestige for the British. The Royal Navy was their pride. But here we should also try to think in such a way as the British task force commander might have thought.
Henry Harwood was commander of the cruiser task force, which comprised heavy cruiser Exeter and 2 light cruisers, Ajax and Achilles.
After the Germans had sunk the Doric Star and another vessel, after that, the British understood that Graf Spee was in the South Atlantic. So, Harwood was thinking, sure, they were enemies, but they were seafarers and commanders after all. Look, when Harwood received word that the Doric Star had been sunk near the West African coastline, he didn't just sit on his hands. He considered the available options the raider had. The raider could have gone north and returned home to Germany, and thus have finalized her mission. Or the raider might try her luck one more time near Buenos Aires and Montevideo, where major sea trade routes converged. Harwood weighed these two options. The difference between them was 90 degrees, a route to the west or one to the north, and he decided to go west, where he met Graf Spee.
I have a question. Could the Germans have avoided the battle? We know what happened, and you have to ask yourself, why did they engage in that battle? The Germans were the first to spot the British task force, but what did they have in their minds? They figured out that the British had a heavy cruiser and 2 destroyers. But 2 destroyers? I mean, you're going up against 3 ships. It's risky to go 1 on 3.
I'll tell you what Langsdorff thought, based on some sources that I read previously. At first, Langsdorff spotted just the tops of the British masts, and he thought that their ships were 2 destroyers and a light cruiser. Even though he had a pocket battleship, it was still a battleship with a 280mm caliber. The British task force they thought they were dealing with would have been a mere punching bag for the German ship. One more thing, he thought that if there were 2 destroyers and a light cruiser, there would probably be a convoy around, which meant that he could abandon his plans of going to the River Plate.
If the German commander had access to the airplane that the crew hadn't been able to fix, it was highly probable that Langsdorff would have discovered that he was opposed by 2 light cruisers and a heavy one. Maybe he would have turned back in this case.
I don't think so.
He was overconfident.
No, it wasn't overconfidence. It was a calculated decision. He perfectly knew what his enemies were, even 2 light cruisers and a heavy one. Admiral Graf Spee was created to fight against them. He thought the German ship would easily defeat them.
Fine then. Let's come back to it after we talk about the battle. So, early in the morning on December 13th, they spotted each other. The Germans were the first to open fire. 2 ranging salvos, and the 3rd salvo hit Exeter. Dozens of crew members died.
Many crew members were killed instantly. The most interesting part is that Harwood, who commanded the British squadron, had lectured a course on how to destroy a pocket battleship to artillery officers in the Royal Naval Academy. In theory, it was him who had developed warfare tactics to fight against that particular ship type.
Did he follow his own tactics?
Yes, and he was at the right place. He directed 2 of his light cruisers to one side of Admiral Graf Spee and Exeter to the other side. 203mm artillery guns are pretty good armament, and it's a serious caliber for a heavy cruiser. But firing range is everything in this case.
I totally agree. Furthermore, the Germans recalled that even though the return fire wasn't as heavy as theirs, the British fired precisely and rapidly. If one of those 203mm shells had hit the German ship 1 meter lower, it would have hit the engine room, and the battle would have turned out pretty badly for the Germans. But the Germans got lucky, and the British didn't.
One could call it a lottery, 50-50 chance. Then, Exeter was hit with a 280mm high-explosive shell. A 300-kilogram shell exploded. Exeter had already lost half of her survivability and was retreating from the battle. Sure, the British ship was still firing at her German adversary, but the primary role of fighting against the pocket battleship shifted to the light cruisers. Okay, getting back to the course lectured by Harwood, what advice did he give about fighting against a pocket battleship? He suggested approaching the opponent as close as possible and continuously firing at it with 152mm shells from rapid-firing guns.
Langsdorff was aware of that because the first aimed salvos from Achilles and Ajax proved to be quite impactful on the Germans. The ship took damage, and Langsdorff was injured and shell-shocked. His arm was injured, he lost consciousness, and he was out of the battle for a while. After he regained consciousness and got back to commanding the ship, as many officers from his crew remarked, he had lost his resolve. He stopped believing in their success and began making poor decisions. At least that was what was written in the reports of the German officers who served with Langsdorff on Admiral Graf Spee. I don't know whether it's true or not, but a grain of truth can be found there.
I don't know how bad the decisions that Langsdorff made were, because he'd already turned back and exposed the rear of the ship by that moment. What was he afraid of? He was afraid of being hit by torpedoes, because the British cruisers...
In his turn, he understood that it was extremely dangerous to get hit with 6-inch, in other words, 150mm shells at close range.
Then the moment came when, this part is about his resolve, when he found himself in that position and saw that the light cruisers were faster and closing the distance to his ship. What was the point in exposing their side to a torpedo attack?
That makes sense.
It was better to expose the rear and fall back.
The German ship retreated with the cruisers in pursuit. They exchanged pretty accurate salvos, and then both sides understood that there was no point in continuing the battle.
I read an interesting part of the memoirs of the pilot who controlled Ajax's catapult-launched airplane to help regulate artillery fire. He witnessed how the ships almost simultaneously peeled away and abandoned the battle. The active phase of the battle ended 90 minutes after the start.
If we review these 90 minutes of the battle, then the German pocket battleship emerged victorious. She didn't suffer any serious damage, wasn't listing, and her propulsion and main guns were fully functional. The ship's light artillery was damaged, that's true, but the primary artillery was intact. And I think the Germans could have continued the battle. Some ship parts were damaged, but we'll look at that later. As far as the British ships go,
Exeter left the battle. The ship needed repairs.
The light cruisers suffered some damage, and their ammunition was almost depleted. If I recall correctly, they had around 10 torpedoes left between them. The amount of torpedoes was enough for just a single salvo. 2 salvos at most. By and large, the Germans won the battle, and the British should have acknowledged their defeat and fallen back. But no.
They didn't have to. The British knew where the German ship was heading.
They could guess.
They guessed where the Germans were heading, and they followed Graf Spee until night fell. Graf Spee was firing back.
She was trying to fend them off.
Right. She was fending the British ships off, but Ajax and Achilles stayed on the German ship like a couple of bloodhounds and chased her to the coast of South America.
That's where a question arises. What was Langsdorff intending to do to them? The British ships were following him. It was clear that Graf Spee was leading the way, and the British were just tailing her. Where was Langsdorff heading? Basically, he had 2 options. Option number 1, fight. He didn't know the technical state of the 2 British cruisers or how much ammo they had. Plus, night was drawing near. A night battle would have been extremely dangerous. The Germans could get hit with torpedoes and 152mm shells from close range, and the outcome of such a battle would be totally unpredictable. The other option was to retreat. So Langsdorff decided to retreat. But where to? Rio de Janeiro was too far. The Germans would surely fail to reach it. Their fuel was running low. They were left with Buenos Aires and Montevideo, the capitals of Argentina and Uruguay, respectively. Buenos Aires was a good choice. As far as I remember, the relations between Argentina and Nazi Germany weren't bad at that time, generally speaking.
Well, it wasn't so straightforward. At the very least, Argentina was neutral. About that, I'll get coffee and then say more.
Fine.
Here, Argentina had been neutral since World War I, and that factor had saved the country from collapse. During that time, Argentina became one of the leading countries, at least on the South American continent. After World War I, immigrants from Europe, particularly from Germany, started coming en masse to Argentina. The German community in Argentina was strong, and many former officers of the Kaiser's army had entered service in the Argentinian armed forces after World War I.
Well, it was their only craft.
Yeah, half of their generals were German officers before. Thus, pro-German sentiment had grown strong in the army after the Nazis came to power. The Argentinian government ended up between a rock and a hard place because local businessmen who traded beef and grain with Britain and the USA were afraid of losing their profits if Argentina took the Axis side. As a result, when World War II broke out, Argentina tried to sustain an indecisive and shaky neutrality because the country's volunteers had allegiances to both sides, Germany and the Allies.
If the Germans were to have headed for Buenos Aires, they would have had to navigate the entire River Plate estuary. However, it's hard to do this at night. If you run aground, you're basically done. Your ship would be riddled with torpedoes and shells from close range, and you wouldn't have a chance to do anything about it. No chance to maneuver, no nothing. But we can only guess what made Langsdorff set a course to Montevideo. These are just our ideas. He didn't leave any notes about that. He just said, "We're going to Montevideo."
I think the same.
Do you think his shell shock was the cause of that?
No, it wasn't because of the shell shock.
Got hit on the head and went to Montevideo.
I have an argument against shell shock affecting his decision. Montevideo is closer to the open sea,
Well, yes.
while Buenos Aires is deeper in the estuary of the River Plate. One can enter the open water from Montevideo and get lost in the vast ocean. Admiral Graf Spee remained seaworthy after the battle. The damage done had just reduced her speed a bit. The ship could still get away, and that was why she headed for Montevideo.
On the whole, I have the following objections with respect to Hans Wilhelm Langsdorff. He didn't put up a fight when he should have finished the British ships off. He didn't dare to. Well, as we mentioned, he wasn't sure about the outcome. He didn't dare to fight and headed for the port, where the ship was then blocked. That was that. After that, a completely different story started.
A case where the battle was resolved not on the battlefield.
Yeah, here goes diplomacy.
And not with weapons, but with words and diplomacy. So Graf Spee arrived in Montevideo and requested that the government of Uruguay give them 2 weeks to fix the ship. The locals sent a group of technicians to evaluate the status of the ship.
By the way, the request fell under international laws.
Langsdorff referred to a precedent when a British cruiser had been repaired in South America during World War I. The British had been given 2 weeks without any problem then.
While the ship was being repaired, other German forces, primarily submarines, would have come. The Germans would have put up a fight against the British fleet.
It seems to me that the Germans thought about breaking through, as opposed to fighting against the British fleet.
Sure, their primary task was to break through.
Regarding the diplomacy issue, the British envoy in Montevideo was a very influential person. Some say that he played golf with the leading politicians of the country and had a great influence on them.
As a result, Langsdorff was given only 24 hours. If I'm correct, he was given like 2 days?
No, he was given 3 days.
3 days?
But after just 1 day had passed, the Germans had a visit to inform them that they weren't welcome there. Getting back to the answer, what exactly brought Admiral Graf Spee and Langsdorff to ruin? A bluff.
Just a bluff.
That was because the British side played a real spy game. They spread disinformation that a large British task force was coming to Buenos Aires. Graf Spee would be blocked in, with no chance to get away.
Plus, the Germans were being constantly observed because British commercial vessels were anchored close to Graf Spee. The closest British vessel was just 300 meters from the German ship. 300 meters. Naturally, they could clearly observe everything that was happening on the German ship through binoculars. No move on the German ship remained unnoticed. Langsdorff understood the situation and his position. He had nowhere to go. He was constantly discussing the situation via a direct communication line with Raeder, the head of the naval command, and Hitler. The decision was made to scuttle the ship. The ship was taken out to sea and mined in 6 spots. The citizens of Montevideo, while walking along the waterfront, could witness 6 powerful explosions from the cruiser, which stood at a distance in neutral waters. It happened on December 17, 1939. All in all, as a result of negotiations, Langsdorff and his crew found themselves in Buenos Aires. The crew were released quite fast, and they employed different ways of returning to Germany.
It happened because the Argentinian officials, let's say, turned a blind eye to the internment and just let the crew go.
An artillery officer of the pocket battleship, Paul Ascher, returned to Germany and was enlisted to the same post aboard Bismarck. He then went on to play an active role in sinking HMS Hood. Sure, not long after, as we know the history of Bismarck, and he would go down together with the ship. That's the fate of a sailor. But if, for example, he would have been interned, who knows how the fate of Hood would have played out? All because of one man who, as far as I can see, was a skilled artillery officer.
The senior artillery officer demonstrated his skills in the Battle of the River Plate. You can't deny that. He took out a heavy cruiser in a mere 20 minutes. Then he was enlisted to Bismarck. Quite a resume.
With respect to Langsdorff, as we mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, after he had written the letter, he wrapped himself in the flag of his ship, Admiral Graf Spee, and shot himself. Another interesting thing, if we're talking about fate, doom, that kind of stuff, Langsdorff committed suicide just 2,000 kilometers from the Falkland Islands, which were the last haven for naval officer Maximilian Von Spee, Langsdorff's old neighbor.
They lived and died as neighbors.
That's right, neighbors from Dusseldorf. I think it's more than 11,000 kilometers from Germany. These 2 officers met their fates in a similar part of the world. The ship that had been named after Maximilian von Spee was buried on the bottom of the sea nearby as well. It's a naval nightly novel.
By the way, we've somehow forgotten about another figure of that raid, cargo ship Altmark. But the story of Altmark is a completely different one.
Let's talk about that next time. Share your thoughts with us in the comments. Do you like it or not? What other naval events would you like to learn about?
Tell your friends and relatives about the Naval Stories podcast. Today, we've discussed the Battle of the River Plate.
I'm Alexander Ustinov.
And I'm Alexander Uvaro.
Until next time.
The Naval Stories podcast.